Our speaker this evening is the Reverend Dr. Becket Soule, who holds a professional certificate in genealogical research from Boston University and is active in a number of genealogy societies. He's taught at the Catholic University of America, the Dominican House of Studies, the Pontifical College Josephinum, and Oxford University, and is Emeritus Professor of Canon Law at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Ontario. And he's now pastor of St. Margaret of Scotland Catholic Church in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. So I will go ahead and hand it over to him.
Thank you, Kate. One of the things that I want to say up front is because I've been teaching this for a bit over 30 years, I have a different point of view for church records than I think many others, particularly genealogists, may have, because I am trying to tell people how to record these records, what to put in them, how to preserve them. And it's not so much looking for those who are going to try to find the parents of their great-great-grandparents or something like that. So with that caveat at the very beginning, let me go. So you should be seeing the first slide up there. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then deal with two sets of questions. The first is, what records are kept? If you are looking in the church records, what are you likely to find? And the second is, where are they kept? And that may be something that is more difficult to deal with than the first question. And then the thing that I have to give another caveat with regard to is the whole question of availability, because availability may change rapidly as well as radically from one place to another, but I'll try to talk about that and what is available, where do you find it, and where can you get some workarounds from all of this. So starting out with a very brief introduction, the Catholic Church has been keeping records, particularly on the reception of sacraments, but also on anything that will connect to a person's canonical, and I'm using that to mean legal status according to church law, and it's been doing that for centuries. This has been more closely regulated since the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. So the first question is, what records are kept? And now a lot of these are in the handout, so I'm going to be going fairly quickly through the text here. But Canon 535 of the Code of Canon Law, which uses almost exactly the same language as Canon 480 of the previous law. There was one code of Canon Law in 1917, and then this was revised in 1983. But there is not much of a change between the law in these two places. And this is what is in your, and this is really what starts out your handout. So each parish is to have parochial registers, that is those of baptisms, marriages, deaths, and others as prescribed by the Conference of Bishops. Each nation has a Conference of Bishops, or the diocesan bishop can give the rules for his own diocese. And the pastor is to see that these registers are accurately inscribed and carefully preserved. It used to be, and I'm going to say up until about the end of the 19th century, that it was simply one of those regular books, and the pastor would be recording all of the information in sentence after sentence after sentence. And some of the pastors were fairly complete, and others, not surprisingly, were not. starting about the end of the 19th century, church supply companies would provide blank registers, in which case all you have to do is fill in the blanks for the names, and that is certainly what is most common right now. But once you go earlier than the end of the 19th century, you will frequently simply see a regular notebook, and all of the information will be put there in that. There has been a greater emphasis in recent years on accuracy and preservation, but sometimes it's going to be difficult to find where exactly these are, particularly when the parish has been closed or merged with another parish, and in cases in which there has been a fire or some other sort of catastrophic event which has consumed these registers. So just simply looking at the registers that are there on the parish level, the first is the baptism register. And there are two things that are important to recognize here, so that there are two different, related but different documents that are important with this. One is the register itself, the entry there in the sacramental register, because the sacramental register is permanent. It's a historical record. And so you're looking for something which has quality construction, a permanent binding. There will frequently be there'll be an index, and unusually, I guess, the index is often at the front rather than at the back of the register, but that is because nobody is actually going to go through these records in order. You're usually going to be looking for some person in particular. Now, many places are now computerizing their records, and while that is common, and it certainly helps when you're trying to find particular information, it's also true that there is always a written form. There is always a physical register, and that's because that's what's required by the law. And to say something a little bit more about that, it's because this way it is going to be preserved. If you've got something, even something which is digitized, as any librarian knows, within a certain period of time, the pixels are going to start dropping out, and it's going to be more and more difficult to get the complete thing as there's a deterioration of the record. And that's why certainly somebody like myself, who deals a lot with the Middle Ages, I am dealing with records from the 12th century, and those look exactly the same as they did centuries ago. So that's the register, and the first thing that you get is a register entry. What you may also get is a certificate, and this is something which is given to the person who has been baptized. The important thing about the certificate is not so much that it is giving you information about the person, but on the back of the certificate, and we'll see examples of this in a couple of minutes, there will be what are known as annotations. So the baptismal register is a person's, to use, I guess, the language that you scare children with in school, this is your permanent record. And anything that would affect your status when you get married, when you receive the sacrament of confirmation, if you get ordained, if you join a religious order, all of these things are then put in your baptismal register. And that's why if you're looking for the mother lode of information, that's where you should look. The also in this, the sources are significant because you never you never can be sure of who the informant is, but in some cases, the law itself states who the informant is. So, for example, in the case of the birth of a child, the baptism of a child, the informant is normally going to be the mother of the child, who obviously was there when the child was born. In some cases, where the father is either unknown or where the mother would prefer that the father's name not be given, there will simply be a notation, typically in Latin, pater ignotus, father unknown. But if it is on a birth certificate, then frequently that information will also be considered in the baptism register because it's considered to be a public record. Now, the kind of information that is in this, that the one thing that I have to constantly point out is that the only thing that a register entry or a certificate attests to is that this person was baptized by this person on this date. That's it. Now, there will be a lot of other information, but that is not what that is a record for. And that's something you always have to keep in the back of your mind. A lot of times people will come to me and say, well, you know, we found out actually that this was not the person's father, or this, in a couple of cases, even this wasn't the person's mother. And the only thing you can say is that's not what that record is proving. The only thing that it is proving is that a sacrament, namely baptism, was conferred on a particular date. And so keep that in the back of your mind. There'll be a lot of other information, and most of the time it's really great, and it saves you a lot of steps. But there is a higher possibility that this may not be accurate. The kind of things that would be on there are, for example, other sacraments that the person has received, and this will normally be in a column on the right-hand side of the page, so that if they have been married, if they have received confirmation, if they've been ordained, if they've taken vows in a religious order, all of these things would be in that column on the right-hand side. There will typically be the names of the parents, date and place of birth, the names of the godparents or Christian witnesses. In the Catholic Church, to have a godparent, the godparent must be a Catholic, though Eastern Orthodox will be admitted in certain circumstances. In the case of someone who is not a Catholic, they can be admitted, but as a Christian witness. They are witnessing the conferral of baptism there. There are never more than 2 godparents. For example, in the Episcopal Church, there is a long-standing tradition of having 3, 2 of the sex of the person being baptized and 1 of the opposite sex. But in the Catholic Church, canon law only allows for 2 at most godparents, 1 male and 1 female. The law doesn't permit more than 2 godparents, nor does it permit 2 godparents of the same sex. And in a number of cases and in a number of communities, there is a longstanding tradition to have more than one, and they will all be recognized as godparents, but they are only going to be, only two are going to actually show up in the register. There are issues with regard to single parents. I've mentioned that something somewhat in passing. The name of the mother is entered in the register if there is public proof of her maternity. And here we're talking about a birth certificate. Or if she states in writing that she is the mother, or she states this before two witnesses. The name of the father, in the case of an unmarried woman, the name of the father is inserted only if there is public proof, again, on the birth certificate, or by his own sworn declaration before the pastor and two witnesses. If no public proof is available for the father, then the name of the father or the mother is not recorded, and the phrase either father unknown or something like a foundling, mother unknown, is placed in the record. If there's an emergency baptism, so that it's not done in a church, but in a hospital, let's say, in danger of death, then that is also recorded in a particular way. And we'll see a couple of examples of that. And finally, adoption. Canon law requires that notations relative to adoption are to be included in a person's baptismal record. And the National Conference of Catholic Bishops put out regulations for how this was to be done. The important distinction is between where the adoption occurs before the baptism and where the adoption occurs after the baptism. And there are some things in the handout with regard to that. But one of the important things there is that no mention of the fact of adoption is to be made on a baptismal certificate that's issued by the parish. So that this is probably, I would say, the number one reason why people are not given direct access to baptismal registers. And then finally, at the end, there are the annotations in this. So let's look at some examples here. I'll come back to marriage in a couple of minutes. So here, and this is from St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Jersey City, New Jersey. And you can see that these are from the early part of the 20th century, both of them in November of 1903. I'm going to say it changed somewhere in the vicinity of the middle of the 20th century. Before that, it's always going to be recorded in Latin. But a lot of times it's easy enough to figure out. So looking at well, the second, who is a great aunt of mine, ego infrascriptus, I, the undersigned, baptizavi, I baptized, Josephata, this is Josephine, Natam, because it's a female, on the 22nd of November in 1903, and then it gives the names of the parents, Frank, as he was known, Francisco Oskowski, and giving the address there, Tunnel Avenue in Jersey City, and Agata Kiselewska, and it does not give her her residence because her residence is the same as her husband's. And the Petrini, the godparents, were Frank Laskowski, and don't ask me to attempt the Polish pronunciations, but Helen is the first name there. And then you see in the it says observations, but in the right-hand column, you will see the annotations. So in the first one, in that, it says married, Walter Kwiatkowski, on the 31st of January, 1959, and it gives the church, St. Anastasia in Teaneck, New Jersey, by the Reverend, and actually his name was Silverius, Quigley. It's a parish run by Carmelite friars. If you look at the second one down there for Josephine Laskowski, a matrimonial conjuncta joined in marriage to, and therefore in the dative case, Francisco Martini, giving the date, 14th of October, 1939, the Church of St. Anne's. And there is sometimes more and sometimes less information there, but there will be, that's going to be put in the side. Unusually, because the one thing that would not be in this record would be a record of a death. So you don't know when they're, if someone is dead, but you see in the left-hand column on the first one, the name of the first husband of Mary Missia, and that he died on the in 1946, and so hence married Walter in 1959. So sometimes you get other information, sometimes you don't. So that if you look here in the lower right corner where I've got the red arrow there, it's the same sort of thing. Ego infrascriptus, I, the undersigned, baptizavi, I have baptized here Helen Hedwig, and then the date on which that happened. This is another child of Frank and Agatha Laskowski, and it gives the names of the godparents. But you'll note there in the observation, it had married Walter Jones, not a very Polish name, on the 31st of May, 1931 in Jersey City. And then in Latin, to keep prying eyes away from it, coram ministerio. And that is a notation that the marriage took place before a non-Catholic minister. And therefore, the Catholic Church did not recognize, because of something called canonical form, did not recognize that particular marriage. Frequently, there will not be any notation at all, but in this case, quite unusually, and that actually is in pencil in the original register. But there are a limit, what I would say are just a limited number of the Latin taglines. Here is from a marriage register, and looking at across, and this is from the church that I mentioned before, from St. Anastasia's in Teaneck, New Jersey. I have two of the entries that are that have red arrows. On the upper one, it gives the person's name, and it said married to, and it gives another person's name, and that this marriage was declared null by the Newark Chancery, and it gives the date for that, so that this is a second marriage. And I know I have had long knockdown, drag out fights with people, particularly in presentations in at institutes and things like that, where they say the Catholic Church, when they give a declaration of nullity, only is making a statement with regard to the validity of the sacrament. And that is not true, because in about a third of all cases, neither of the people who are requesting an annulment are Catholics. And in many cases, neither of them are even Christians. So that you're not talking about a sacrament at all. The Catholic Church is basically making a statement whether or not this person is held by what's called an impediment of prior bond, because you cannot marry someone else if your previous spouse is still alive. If you look at the second one, the lower one there, you see two different notations. The first is a dispensation from the three bands of marriage. Frequently, there will be a dispensation from that if you can prove that someone is free to marry in some other way. And in the second one, you have a dispensation from what's called disparity of cult. And that is a Catholic marries someone who is not baptized. And a dispensation is necessary for that, but that's where it's recalled. That's where it's recorded. You can also see there in the right-hand column, in some cases it says nuptialis, and that means that there was a nuptial mass, which means both of the people were Catholics, or PM. So that does not mean in the afternoon. It means that it is matrimonium privatum, that it is not private in the sense of secret, but in the Latin, privata is deprived, so it's deprived of all of the ceremonies of the Mass. It is simply a wedding ceremony. Here is St. Nathan's Catholic Church in Brookline, Massachusetts, and you can see at the top one there, a name that you may find familiar. In Latin, of course, John Fitzgerald, and then tried to spell Kennedy a couple of different ways there. And when he is baptized, when he is born, and then when he married to Jacqueline Bouvier below there. And then you see someone with a very fancy handwriting adding things on the right. Elected President of the United States of America on the 9th of November, 1960, and assassinated in Dallas, Texas on the 22nd of November, 1963, requiescat in pace. In that same register, you can see some other notations. Sometimes it is fully filled out, so that here obtained the Pauline privilege, which is another way of entering a second marriage while the first spouse is still alive, and that's on the left, and that it was the banns were dispensed twice. Banns were supposed to be published 3 times, and in this case, they were published only once. On the other side there, on the right, you can see an emergency baptism, neo conversam, so a new convert, in articulo mortis, in danger of death, and then in a nosocomium, which is a sanitarium, and then the remaining ceremonies were added, as you see there, in 1914. So going back to talk about what you've seen already with regard to marriage, in some cases, the marriage is entered into by the two people. In other cases, it may be known as a convalidation, and that is they were married civilly, and what they are now doing is exchanging consent. And so that there will not, for example, be a marriage certificate, but it's that these two people have now decided to marry in the church. And then there's also a sanation, which is if there was something missing when these two people originally married, then they would be, it's a retroactive convalidation. So it is being made, it's the legal effects of marriage are being read back to the original exchange of consent. In the case of marriage, the original church of the baptism of the Catholic party or parties is noted, and that's how you get the name of the spouse in the baptismal register. There are also, as you saw, with dispensations and permissions. And in the case of the source and the information recorded, it's the same thing. Typically, it is from what is known as the prenuptial investigation. So the information comes from the parties themselves. Now let's move on to the death register. Typically, the source of information in a death register is going to be the funeral director. The information to be recorded is, I'm going to say as often as not all of this is recorded, but for example, the name, the residence, the last residence of the person, the date of death, the date of burial, the place of burial. Sometimes you will also get the cause of death. And in some cases, particularly where there has been a cremation, there will be some other information that is put there. But unusually, there is no notification to the Church of Baptism, so that if you've got a baptismal record, it is rare, very rare, that you will ever see a notification of the fact that the person has died. There are a number of other registers that are that record, for example, reception of First Holy Communion, reception of the Sacrament of Confirmation. These are separate registers, but they would all then be sent to the original baptismal register. And modern registers, so the rite of Christian initiation of adults, so converts would have a special register for that. Now, where are the records kept? And this is kind of looking at it as a whole. In the case of sacramental records, they would be kept in the individual parish where the sacrament was administered. There may be language issues. In many cases, the record is going to be in Latin, increasingly after the middle of the 20th century in English. But if you've got an immigrant community, then it may be kept in the original language that was spoken, so Polish or Vietnamese or something like that. In the case of closed or merged or divided parishes, the register may be in maybe someplace else. And that's why if you look in what's known as the Kennedy Directory, the official Catholic directory, it will say where the parish records are for a closed parish or a merged parish. In the case of chaplaincies, so whether it is a campus ministry or something like that, hospital chaplaincy, the records are going to be kept in the local parish and not at the chaplaincy. In the case of military families, they are centralized by the Archdiocese for the military services. And that is in Washington, D.C., and almost everything is computerized. And while they may take a while to get back to you, they will give you every bit of information that they've got, which is typically going to be different if it was on a base or if it was on a local parish that was near a military base. Going up a level, there are records which are relevant for genealogical research on the diocesan level. Here, judicial records, particularly declarations of nullity. If they are, and I'm going to just make a guess here, if they are within the last 100 years, you will not have access to them. But if you are looking into the 19th century, typically they will be microfilmed. You may find a record of them in the baptismal register, and so that there is some more information that might be available there. You find someone who has a different name, for example. Ordination, if somebody was ordained, this would be kept on the diocesan level. Member of a religious order or a religious congregation or a society of apostolic life, somebody who's made vows, this would be kept at the religious order. So they have their own archives. So if you've got a school, for example, that has been run by a number of sisters, and that's where you would go to look for that, and it would have a lot of information there. Increasingly, dioceses are centralizing their record keeping, and so that after a certain period of time, all of the registers are sent to a central point. Sometimes they are digitized, sometimes they're not, but increasingly, not always, but frequently, there is a central point that all of these registers, particularly historic registers, would be kept. And lastly, I think a lot of times people don't think of this, but the Roman Curia, because the Catholic Church is a worldwide institution, and they have been keeping records in the Roman Curia since the 15th century. There are a couple of others that I'll mention here, like the Apostolic Penitentiary, and that's a person and not a place. There are limitations on access, but frequently they are open for research and scholarship after about 100 years, and even more frequently as you get closer. So that, for example, the records with regard to the Second World War and refugees have been opened, and that's fairly recent. So the Holy See, and so this is Rome that we're talking about. It's functioned in several different capacities. It has a fairly complicated organization. The bulk of the archives of the in Rome are they pertain to the period from the 16th century to the present. And then one of my absolutely favorite books is this, and I've got the I'll talk about this in another minute. The Vatican Archives Project of the University of Michigan put together a database to cover all of the archives of the various parts of the Roman Curia. And this is a marvelous record. Some of the important archives are the historical archives of the Congregazione per l'Evangelizzazione dei Popoli, popularly known as the Congregation Propaganda Fidei. And this was for missions. Recall that the Catholic Church in the United States was a missionary church until 1908. And so there are lots of records in Rome about the church in the United States before 1908. The various tribunals, the Rota Romana, which is a marriage tribunal, the Signatura, which is the appeals court of that, and the Apostolic Penitentiary, which deals with what's called the internal forum, confidential matters. There is no access to the modern congregations. For a while, I worked for the Congregation for the Eastern Churches in Rome. See, these are the Eastern Catholic churches and not the Eastern Orthodox churches. And the Holy Office, which is the Roman Inquisition, so that even if it is more than 100 years, you still don't get access to those at all. Here is the book for Vatican Archives, an inventory and guide to historical documents of the Holy See. I am not sure whether it is still in print. I looked at Amazon today and was horrified to see that they're selling it for like $300. I got it when it first came out in the late 90s, but there are 500 entries and it tells you all of the archives in the Vatican and which are available and which are not. Finally, accessibility. It's a number of places consider these records to be public. The sacramental records are public in that legally they will stand as valid, authentic evidence when an appropriate civil record doesn't exist, so that frequently you can go with a baptism certificate in if you don't have a birth certificate. And most places other than the United States view church records as public records. In the United States, however, there is increasingly a sense that sacramental records are private in that they are created in circumstances presumed to be personal and confidential. There is also a sense of decentralization. Sometimes records may be in the diocese, and sometimes they may be in a parish. Sometimes they may be, someplace else. I got this from one diocese that I had been working for and had given them a series of sacramental record policies. And they said sacramental registers are not open to examination by anyone except authorized church and parish personnel. And I'm going to say that's about half of them. The other half, if you just walk in and ask the parish secretary, "Hi, I'm a genealogist and I want to take a look at this," and the secretary will be great and give you the register and set you up in the room. They'll look at you all of the time. So it's, it's the fourth part is just luck. So anyone can obtain an authenticated certificate of his or her own sacramental record, and with proper identification, certificates of direct relatives or legal dependents. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't, and I really wish that I could tell you that there was consistency, but there isn't. And it's not even in contiguous places. There's one diocese in New England, and I know that they will not let anyone look at any records at all. And the diocese that is right next to it will give you full access when you ask for it. And so there's no rhyme or reason. And so a lot of this is just simply luck. So that is the previous picture. There is my church up here in the Smokies, and that is one of our local visitors. So there are my email addresses: rcdoc, Roman Catholic Diocese of Charlotte .org, or you can try wbsoule1620, and you all know what that means, at Gmail. So if I can answer questions, or if you have any comments to make, or if I can be of any assistance, please do get in touch with me by email.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions for you, so we can go ahead and get into those. So our first one is somebody is asking if a Catholic church burned, this is late 1800s, 1899, would there be a duplicate record? Would there be any duplicates?
In the case of a marriage register, let's say, there would still be a record of it in the baptismal register. Now, if they were baptized and married in the same church, then you're probably out of luck. But in some cases, there would be a certificate that was given to people at the time. And so that would have the same information. It wouldn't be in the register. But I've been doing, obviously, as you can see, I've been doing some work around in New Jersey, and published an article about 2019 or so, about some work that I had done there. But it is not infrequent that you will find, particularly in immigrant communities, you will not have a marriage license, but you will have a religious ceremony, a record of a religious ceremony. And that's typically, as I said, in immigrant communities.
So how would the marriage be noted in the baptismal record when the marriage was performed somewhere else in a different location?
It would be exactly the same way. I mean, you saw, for example, in some of them on the side there, that it was in another parish, so that you would give the place, the date, and the name of the spouse. And if it's in the same parish, they still will do the same thing, but they won't list. Sometimes you will see that there's no mention of a church there, and that means that it's in the same church.
We have a couple of questions, just wondering if you have any best tips or ways to maybe communicate to a parish secretary, for example.
You will have the best chance of success if you have someone requesting their own certificate or information about themselves or their parents or something like that. If you can show some sort of connection between the people, you'll have a much better chance of success. But simply, going to the parish and saying, I want to see your confirmation register in order to look at the confirmation of John Smith or Mary Jones. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. The other thing is call, both with regard to going to the archives of a diocese, particularly where there is where all of the records have now been consolidated in one place. Always call first, and don't just kind of show up and say, I want to see this, because in every case that I know of, in which people have gone to the diocesan archives, they've been very helpful, as long as you're not talking about something that's fairly recent. I mean, if you're talking 19th century, even early 20th century, in every case. So if you can go to the diocese, if you go to parishes, that can be hit and miss. But always call first. Don't just show up.
Thank
And
you.
they are increasingly having best practices for repositories, telling you what you can bring in and what you will have access to and things like that. In most cases, you will not be able to make copies. So bring your laptop.
Someone else is asking about school records. Would those be kept at the diocesan level or at the actual school?
Because schools in the Catholic Church are, there's a wide variety of who they are run by. In some cases, they would be religious orders. So sisters, teaching brothers, priests, things like that. And they would be kept not at the school, but probably in the archives of the religious order. Now, if the school, particularly if the school is no longer functioning, if the school is functioning, they may, again, they may have or may not have things available there at the school. But if it is run by so that, for example, I'm a Dominican and we run Providence College in Rhode Island, and not only are our records there, our headquarters are in New York, but the actual archives are there in Providence, Rhode Island. But also there are a lot of the records from Providence College that are there as well. So if there's a religious order that's involved, because they've got a lot of, I don't mean to say cheap labor, but they've got a lot of people who can work together in order to preserve all of this. And that is, and so that there's a better chance. But most of the time, in the case of a religious order, things will be sent there every so often. And let's say every 10 years, 20 years, something like that. So because there's no reason really for them to keep it in, you know, far away, because everybody knows that they can go to the central place in order to find their answers.
We have a couple of questions about Latin. So one of the tools I know that can be helpful is there's a family search wiki, a family search word list for Latin terms, but do you have any tips for names in Latin? Because they're often different from the same name in English. So do you have any tips for figuring out what the name is when it's written in Latin?
Well, I mean, you saw, for example, Josephine became Josephata. And you know, when you get from a foreign language, meaning not English, into Latin, it can sometimes be difficult. Usually, the boilerplate part of that, yeah, you can kind of pretty much, you know, figure out the date. You know, Novembrus is November, and things like that. But as far as names go, well, I'll give you the example, and this would be my great-great-grandmother, came from Poland, and she is given the first name Agatha. She is given in English, she's given Agata in Polish or Latin. She is given Agnes, and it's just the priest. It depends what the priest wrote down there, and that's about all I can say. And it's I mean, usually, occasionally with abbreviations. So you saw, for example, PM or Matrimonium Privatum there. One of the things you'll note is that it is over and over again. I mean, it's just there are loads of them along the side, so that it's not going to be something that's unusual. And I mean, that's when you send me an email and I'll tell you what it is, because I've taught Latin for well over 40 years. So there is, when I worked in Rome and had to write in Latin, writing decrees and everything like that. And what do you do with different names? This, Carl Eggers, Lexicon Nominum Dictionary of Names. This is they have not published this since like the 1930s. But it's this gives you opening it here at random. Aloysius, a name that we recognize. Aloysius is the Latin form of Alois, Aloysius, Luis, Louis, and Luigi. And so that's so you can go in either direction with this. This is a really useful one. I had to do a decree establishing a diocese, and it was in India, and in Muvatuputsa, I spent an entire week practicing how to say that. And I asked all of the people from India that I knew, what does that mean? And they said, it's a place name. It's Muvatuputsa. Right? Okay. I was because you get certain other names like Broken Bay in Australia is Corvipolitana, or what? That's Wagga Wagga, actually, which is the place where the crows nest. And then, of course, you've got South Bendensis Wayne Castrensis for Fort Wayne South Bend. And but yeah, there are dictionaries that have these things, but after a while, you just look at them and see what you can come up with, and realize that you're writing a name, you're writing the name in a language that the person probably never spoke. And so they wouldn't recognize their own name.
So it looks like we have time for maybe one more question. So I just wanted to mention that if anybody would like a copy of the chat, or if anyone has any additional questions, please send us an email. It's genealogy@acpl.info. So I'll stick that in the chat. And for our last question, someone is asking, they say their grandparents were religious Catholics, but they married at her grandmother's home on a Wednesday afternoon. This was in 1902. So would there be a reason that they wouldn't have married in a church?
Yeah. I mean, you can get a dispensation for that. It could, for example, be, let's say, illness of one of the parties or of the parents, or they're made in a number of cases where the church is under construction. And so you can't really, a lot of times you had Catholic weddings in the rectory through the 50s, because Catholics could not be married in church. But I mean, but you could get a dispensation for that. And because in order to get any dispensation, you have to give a reason. So there's always a reason somewhere.
Thank you very much for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending. And again, for a copy of the chat, or if you have any additional questions, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info. So, thank you again very much.
Thank you.
Good night.